Would like to express our thanks to our two institutional partners, the Centro Studi Americani in Rome and the Italian Academy at Columbia University, whose collaboration we are very grateful for. And I want to also especially express our thanks to the Talbot Hillman Foundation for their support of this event. This morning's, the first panel of today on the divided society will be chaired by Mr. Giuseppe Sarcina, who is known as one of the great experts on the United States in a whole of Europe. Mr. Sarcina is the correspondent for the Corriere della Sera daily newspaper, one of the two widest circulating daily newspapers in Italy, and he is the Washington correspondent. And I am pleased to hand the floor over to you now, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like just to thank Giancarlo Bosetti for this invitation and Ambassador Fondi for his kind support. Today, I think we are going to have a great discussion on a very tough and a critical issue, the divided society. Of course, in the perspective of after November the 3rd, and now that everybody seems to agree after the Joe Biden's victory. So we have a terrific panel here to discuss. We will start momentarily with a keynote speech delivered by Professor Mark Lilla. Everybody knows him as a professor of humanities at Columbia University, New York. Among his books, we can mention The Once and the Future Liberal and After Identity Policies. But Professor Lilla is as well a very powerful columnist. He writes regularly for the New York Times and for the New York Reviews of Book. And his speech will be a sort of journey from Alexis of Tocqueville to Donald Trump. Then we have three other professors, scholars, and they will make very comments. We have Professor Anthony Appiah. And Professor Anthony Appiah is a professor of philosophy and law at the New York University. He has taught at the University of Ghana, Cambridge, Yale, Cornell, Duke, Harvard, and Princeton. And probably I missed something here. Among his books are Cosmopolitanism in 2016, The Ethic of Identity, 2018, and the last one, if I'm not mistaken, is The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, 2018. Then we have Professor Sheri Berman, Professor of Political Science at the Barnard College, Columbia University. She's the author of numerous books and scholarly articles on European politics and political development, the left, fascism, populism, and the fate of democracy. Her latest book is Democracy and the Dictatorships in Europe, from the Ancien Régime to the present day, 2019. Last, but of course not least, Jan Buruma, Dutch writer and an editor who lives and works in the United States. Much of his writing has focused on the culture of Asia, particularly that of China and the 20th century Japan. So I think now it's time to give the floor to Professor Lilla for his keynote. Professor Lilla, please, thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, and hello to everyone on the panel and to those of you in Italy or wherever you're listening to this. The theme of the conference is our divided societies. And I think you'll admit that most of the conversations about this question follow what is by now a familiar script. We tend to focus understandably on the forces, the external forces that we think are making us ill. And we can all draw up our own lists of this, of these elements: incivility, intolerance, dogmatism, reaction, radicalism, identity, social media, and the like. But if we think like doctors, any medical diagnosis of an illness has to focus actually on two factors. One is whatever bacteria or viruses happen to enter the system. The other is the body's pre-existing capacity for resistance, which you might call the immune, what we call in medicine, the immune system. If a body falls ill, it might be due to a new virus and there's no change in the immune system, or it might be due to a collapse of the immune system, which renders the body incapable of resisting bacteria that are around all the time. So there's nothing new in the environment on that latter picture, but rather something has happened within to the host. Now, if you think about it, most of the writing and discussion regarding our divided societies focuses on what we presume to be new microbes, you might say. The new populism, the new racism, the newly partisan media, the new identity politics, neoliberalism. We pay far less attention to what is, so to speak, our political immune system. And that's understandable, because in politics, as in medicine, the immune system is a vague idea. It's just an intellectual construct. The immune system is not something you can touch. It's not something you can put under the microscope. It's a concept. But still, one needs to make a stab at gauging a body's resistance, whether the body of an individual or of a body politic. So the question I want to pose today for our discussion is the following. What are the factors that hold together a democratic society of individuals in the first place? And what changes in those factors might we have noticed in our democracies over the past decade or two? Now, the first question is, of course, a very old question of political psychology, not a political principle. Political psychology is a dying art. No one studies it in the universities. Now, rarely is it studied in the universities, and it's also not something we're terribly good at practicing these days, I think. What we first need now, though, I think, is to better understand the psychological ties that once bound us more tightly. Then we can ask ourselves to what degree those ties may have loosened just of their own accord, and therefore have made us more vulnerable to forces like populism, xenophobia, social media, and the rest. To explore these questions, I'm going to lean heavily on, of course, the greatest psychologist in modern democracy, Tocqueville, not terribly original. But there are two passages in Democracy in America that I've been puzzling over recently as I've been teaching the book. Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America in the 1830s for a French audience that was skeptical, to say the very least, of the prospects of modern democracy. Given the French experience in the half century before his visit to the US, that skepticism was perfectly understandable. One of the charges being made against democracy was that it was atomizing. If everyone were endowed with individual rights and there were no mystical authority above them, the argument went, you would see nothing but division, conflict, selfishness, and indifference to the common good. Well, Tocqueville tries very hard to persuade his French audience that things were turning out differently in the United States. And to explain why, he distinguished between what might be called ancient love of country, he calls it patriotism, and a modern love of country. And this is what he says about the ancient version. There exists a love of country which springs mainly from that instinctive, disinterested, and indefinable feeling which binds a man's heart to his birthplace. This unreflecting love blends with the liking of ancient customs, respect for ancestors, and the memories of the past. Those who experience it cherish their homeland as they love the family house. This love is itself a sort of religion. It does not reason, it believes, it feels, and it acts. It's striking here that Tocqueville uses the language of love to describe patriotism. It's not a love of government or of the state apart from the people in it. It's rather a kind of fellow feeling, what Aristotle called political friendship. The ancient version of this love is deep and enduring so long as it is unreflective, that is instinctive in Tocqueville's view. But it proves to be fragile in periods of profound historical change. Tocqueville again. But sometimes in the life of a nation, there occurs a moment when ancient customs are changed. Behavior patterns are destroyed, beliefs upturned, the value of memories is vanished. And at such a time, men no longer perceive their native land except in a feeble and ambiguous light. It is rooted neither in the land, nor in the customs of their ancestors, which they have been taught now to view as a yoke, nor on religion, which they doubt, nor on laws, which they do not enact, nor on the legislator, whom they fear and despise. And so men retreat into a narrow and unenlightened egoism. They have neither the instinctive patriotism of a monarchy or the reflective patriotism of a republic. Now, this should sound familiar to us. And in fact, in French society in the 1830s, one found a country as pretty much as divided as our own. Over the previous half century, the monarchy had been overthrown, and the First Republic had flamed out in a reign of terror. Then Napoleonic despotism arose and collapsed in turn. And Tocqueville is writing just after the July Revolution of 1830 that put an unloved constitutional monarchy on the throne and a cynical, self-interested bourgeois class in parliament. So the old patriotism is definitely dead. But French conservatives were arguing at the time that it could be revived. We simply have to revive the old feeling for la vieille France. Tocqueville thought that that was impossible. Nations, he says, do not return to youthful opinions any more than men return to the first tastes of infancy. They may regret them, but not rekindle them. And so one must move forward and hurry to unite, in people's eyes, the interest of the individual with that of the country. For disinterested love of country escapes never to return. In other words, modern democratic societies simply cannot be held together any longer by older traditional ties and feelings. But they can be held together, Tocqueville speculates, if self-interest and the public good become associated in people's minds. This, he says, can be the psychological basis of another more rational patriotism. Now, the term rational patriotism sounds like a dispassionate insight born of self-conscious calculation. But love of country and fellow citizens, like any kind of love, is a feeling. It's an affect that inspires sacrifice and a sense of duty. Can a mere political calculation give rise to a political feeling? Obviously not. So, what does Americans' fellow feeling rest on? And this is Tocqueville's response. The thing which keeps a majority of citizens under the same government is much less the rational decision to remain united than the instinctive and, in a sense, unconscious agreement resulting from like feelings and similar opinions. Like feelings and similar opinions. Well, what are those? Well, Tocqueville tells his readers that Americans believe in the authority of reason. They believe in human perfectibility, the inevitability of change, and the possibility of progress. In politics, they believe in the absoluteness of human freedom and of human equality for white people, and of the right to self-government. What's striking in America, though, he thought, is that Americans associate their country and their fellow citizens with these dogmas that he's just listed. And therefore, they come to love their country and fellow citizens as, you might say, a mirror of themselves. This is Tocqueville's deepest psychological insight here, I think, that modern patriotism is nothing but extended self-love. It develops in what a psychoanalyst might call a transference. And this is how he puts it. Men living in democracies love their country after the same manner as they love themselves, and transfer the habits of their private vanity to the vanity of the nation. So this, Tocqueville thinks, is one factor that holds America together. Of course, within 3 decades after his visit, the Civil War broke out. So clearly, democratic identification was not enough to keep the Union together. And in fact, Tocqueville had anticipated this when he noticed the psychological differences that slavery had caused between Southern and Northern elites. After visiting both the North and the South, Tocqueville thought he saw that while ideas shape our opinions, it's social reality that shapes our customs and what he called our characters. And therefore, there can grow up a gap between our ideas and our characters. This is what he says. It is generally believed among us that slavery gives one area of the Union interests that are quite opposed to those of another area. I have not observed this to be the case. Slavery has not created in the South interests opposed to those in the North, but it has altered the character of Southerners, giving them different customs. He then goes on to say that because Northerners are forced to be self-reliant because they don't have slaves, the way they live and the customs they have developed are compatible with and seem to be an expression of America's shared political dogmas. That is, that the ideas that they profess seem to match the way they live. That's not true in the South, he says. There, slave owners were living a contradiction, a couple of contradictions. First, a contradiction between two principles. One is equality, the other is slavery and human hierarchy. The other is a contradiction between the beliefs they profess to share with Northerners and the customs that they themselves had developed by living as slave owners. Tocqueville writes, from birth, the Southern American is invested with a kind of domestic dictatorship. His first conception of life teaches him that he's born to give orders. And the first habits he learns is that of effortless domination. Education, therefore, has a powerful tendency to turn the Southern American into a haughty, hasty, irascible, violent man, passionate in his desires and irritated by obstacles. In a sense, then, the Southerner talks like a Democrat, but perceives reality and has the feelings a little like those of the decadent French aristocrats whom Tocqueville had come to despise. Quote again, the Southerner is not preoccupied with the material cares of life. Someone else takes care to think of them for him. Free in that respect, his imagination is directed towards other greater and less well-defined objectives. The Southerner loves grandeur, luxury, reputation, excitement, pleasure, and above all, idleness. Nothing constrains him to work hard for his livelihood. So what really separates Northerners and Southerners is what Tocqueville himself calls in French, lifestyles, les modes de vie. If two men belonging to the same society have the same interests and to some extent the same opinions, but their characters, education, and style of living are different, it's highly likely they will not see eye to eye. And so it looks like we've come across a second source of unity in democratic societies. The first was this community of feeling that's a product of sharing beliefs, something cognitive. The second source we now see are shared lifestyles that seem compatible with those beliefs. So therefore, to speak medical jargon, we can imagine two ways in which the immune system of a democratic society might be weakened. One way would be a weakening of the community of feeling and beliefs. The other would be a widening of the gap between the ways of life of different groups within the society. This is Tocqueville's argument. And I think it's about time that we try to imitate him and perform this kind of analysis on ourselves as well. It's time to ask ourselves whether an old form of patriotism has disappeared, never to return. The old one now being not the ancient one of monarchy, but the old one being that of republican government. And if so, can we imagine a different basis for what we might as well call postmodern patriotism? At the end of my last book, The Once and Future Liberal, I argued for a robust civic education and citizenship in order to recultivate a sense of shared American destiny and of duty towards each other. Looking back at the conclusion 4 years later now, it strikes me as more of a prayer than as an analysis. After 4 years of Trumpism in the US, and especially the rise of populist authoritarian demagogues in democracies around the world, I'm starting to think that we might be witnessing a deeper historical change taking place. And that is the death of modern democratic patriotism. And not for superficial reasons having to do with partisan politics, but for deeper ones regarding the way we live today, not just in the United States, but in other advanced democracies. Let me mention one development that we're only too familiar with to illustrate the point, and consider it from Tocqueville's psychological point of view. Let's call it the lifestyle gap. We're all aware that the income distribution in our democracies have become wildly and increasingly skewed. We're also aware that meritocratic privilege based on education has increased and colored the new economic class divide. And there are reasons to think that given the nature of the modern global economy and the importance of education for participating in it, this divide may become a permanent and increasingly significant feature of our societies. And one consequence of this divide that we can already see is a growing gap in lifestyles that is starting to rival the 19th century one between white Southern slave-owning landed aristocrats and white Northern small business entrepreneurs. The new lifestyle gap is not what you might expect. Our antiquated assumption is that so-called working class Americans live traditional lives revolving around work and family and church, while the meritocratic elite is less conventional. But in fact, we know now that it is the meritocrats, like us, who are more likely to get and stay married, more likely to have children, more likely to hold steady jobs, more likely to go to church, and more likely to vote. As liberals, we may not think of ourselves and speak of ourselves as traditionalists, but in fact, we are. It is underprivileged white Americans who are marrying less, divorcing more, having fewer kids and more abortions, I might add, using more drugs, and are less likely to be employed or to go to church or to vote. In fact, one could argue, with only slight exaggeration, that today's meritocratic elite now shares many characteristics with antebellum Southern aristocrats. Let me quote what Tocqueville says about them. The Southerner is not preoccupied with the material cares of life. Someone else takes care to think of them for him. Free in this respect, his imagination is directed towards other great and less well-defined objectives. Now, doesn't that sound like us? People in our class have plenty of servants, they just don't live with us. These people, many immigrants, take care of our children, They mow our lawns, they shop for us, they deliver our food, they repair our machines. As meritocrats, we are increasingly cushioned from much of the grind of daily life that our parents and grandparents took for granted. At the same time, disadvantaged Americans are increasingly feeling nothing but the grind imposed by the new economy and by us directly. Quite apart from questions of justice, it's important to recognize that this change in our lifestyles also changes our general outlook on life and our expectations for the future. And how could it not? Our daily lives, not to mention our tastes in food, entertainment, travel, and the like, are increasingly different from and alien to those of the less privileged. That was true in the American past in the 19th century, but it was less true in the decades following World War II, when white Americans pretty much ate the same food, watched the same movies, and attended church at about the same rates, and very few went to college. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, using Tocqueville's terms, that we are developing two very different national characters today. And not just in the United States, but also in other democracies that have been turned inside out and upside down by the global knowledge-based economy. Meritocrats and the less privileged may profess the same attachment to broad democratic values, but they're starting to see each other as different species. Frankly, even our bodies look different. And consequently, it's become even harder for us to enter into each other's heads. Not because we have different values or even different interests, but because our characters have been shaped in different ways. That is one reason why I think it's so hard for those of us in the meritocratic class to understand the deep and visceral attachment the less privileged whites in our democracies have to populist demagogues like Donald Trump, Mario Salvini, and Jair Bolsonaro. Whoever it was who quipped that Donald Trump is a poor person's idea of a rich person got, I think, to the heart of the matter. Donald Trump's lifestyle would be theirs if only they had the money to live it. It would not be how we would choose to live if we had that money. Now, I've said nothing original about contemporary American lifestyles just now. My point is simply been to get us to think about this gap as one psychological element among many that could be weakening our democratic immune systems. Because there are very good reasons to think that disidentification will be with us for some time to come. The global knowledge-based economy and the internet are here to stay. Before the Civil War, Tocqueville declared that the dangers faced by the American Union do not spring any more from diversity of opinion than from diversity of interest. They sprang, he thought, from deeper social and psychological forces. Well, I think that's equally true today. But unlike him, I find it hard to imagine what subatomic forces might hold together the elementary particles that we are becoming. It makes no sense to be nostalgic. Contrary to what some of our national conservatives think, ancient national feeling is not going to return to our republics. Instead, what we are seeing is a surge in ersatz populistic and anti-democratic versions of that feeling. And contrary to what liberals like myself might hope for, the way we live and how we think about ourselves today are starting to appear incompatible with the modern patriotism that Tocqueville analyzed. And if that's the case, where would that leave us? Can we imagine a new basis for unity compatible with the way we're living and thinking now in our different groups? Is it possible to think of some kind of postmodern patriotism that would glue us together? Well, I regret to say I cannot. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Lilla, for your impressive speech. And thanks to remind us how Tocqueville is so actual, in fact. And so now I would like to ask the three other speakers of our panel to make their comments. I would suggest a first round of 5-6 minutes for each speaker, and then I would like to ask a very quick, just one question to all the panelists, and we could wrap up it with the audience's questions. So I give the floor to Professor Anthony Appiah. Thank you very much. Professor Appiah.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mark. That was very well, depressing, but also I think gives us much to think about. So let me say that I'm too am not going to be able to give you a solution to the problem that Mark is trying to diagnose, but I do want to say something about what I think is a philosophical error that explains one feature of our problem, which is the disrespect. One feature of our problem is that there's disrespect among the meritocrats for the rest of the population. We look down on them. And I think that, and they know this, and that's one of the reasons why they don't think well of us. And I think that that would be a difficult problem to solve if we were entitled to look down on them. But I'm going to suggest that it's just a philosophical mistake to think that we have reasons to look down on them, and that we should therefore correct ourselves and abandon what seems to me this error. So that's my task in a few minutes. And the main thing I want to say is something that was said by Michael Young when he invented the word meritocracy in the first book that contains that word and has it in its title. Which is that, well, two things. One is that a system of class filtered by meritocracy is still a system of class involving hierarchies of social respect, which are misapplied to those who don't happen to have whatever the talents and trainings and connections, the social, cultural capital and the human capital that are currently being rewarded by our system. And so that's why the authors of the fictional Chelsea Manifesto, which in his book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, is supposed to serve as the last sign of resistance to the new order, they ask for a classless society, because class identities which persist into meritocracy reduce people in effect to a single measure of worth. This is what the Chelsea Manifesto argues, and only someone with a very limited vision should suppose that human worth can be reduced to a single measure, the measure that is that the meritocracy rewards, which is a kind of effortful application and achievement. Now, Mark's right, we're not a meritocracy, and so pretending that we are is part of the problem. We're not a meritocracy because we've designed a system in which those who already have the cultural and social capital can transfer large parts of it to their children, and so it's not the case that that what we have is a system which rewards talent plus effort, which is what he said the meritocracy aims to be. But my point is that even if it were, there would be something wrong with it if it treats those who don't happen to succeed under the prevailing order as somehow better than everybody else. So I want to suggest a different picture. I think that the right way to think about human achievement is that it involves meeting a challenge posed by three things. Yes, your capacities, what Young called talent, but also the circumstances into which you're born, which is, of course, not something that you choose and have any responsibility for any more than your capacities are. and the projects you yourself decide are important, which is something that you may have some control over. So there are three elements: your capacities, your circumstances, and your projects, that I think are the things that we are faced with when we try to make a life. And my friend Ronnie Dworkin once said that making a life is a performance that demands skill and is the most comprehensive and important challenge we face. But we come with different talents, we're born into different circumstances, and we choose different projects, so that each of us faces, it seems to me, a distinct challenge, a unique challenge. And there isn't a sensible answer to the question whether A meets her challenge better than B does. It's just a stupid question to ask whether Bertrand Russell has a better life than Mozart. The sane answer is that Russell did pretty well with his talents, capacities, and projects, and so did Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But there's no point in trying to say who did better. If you're doing different things and they're non-comparable, that's a pointless question. So that means something, though. It means you can't reward human worth fairly, because there's no way to measure comparatively the thing we're trying to respond to fairly. So there's no adequate measure of merit to respond to fairly. And so the different allocations of the social rewards, money and honor, that we give to different people are not given to them because those who get more of them are worthier in some absolute sense than the others. They're given to them because we need them to, these differences, to incentivize behavior that we want to incentivize. That's what they're for. But they're not, the fact that you do well under the current scoring system is just a piece of luck. It does not reflect any deep superiority, precisely because in the most important measure of what we're doing, namely making a life, there just aren't comparisons to be made. There aren't overall comparisons to be made. Now, I don't know, that's a brief suggestion of what I think the right picture is. I don't know how to persuade people that this is the right picture, but if we did, we could adopt policies commensurate with it that would better bring us together. For example, if the greater rewards of the meritocrats are not a reflection of their greater worth, then we would be entertaining policies such as, for example, guaranteed universal basic incomes that were necessary not as rewards, but as the instruments by which everybody could live a dignified human life, which should be our aim for everybody in our country and for everybody on the planet. So the idea, as I say, rests in the thought that wealth is something that we produce together. We have all these different systems of incentives to make it happen, but it's something we produce together in the end. And so it's right that we should decide together how to share it. And seeing that every life would be made better by starting out with a share of the social product that allows us to make a life that we ourselves have chosen, we should decide to make sure that that is available to everyone. And there is, it seems to me, among the meritocrats, an almost complete indifference to the question of how to secure the dignity of the lives of everybody, including the people who aren't succeeding by the peculiar system of rewards that the meritocracy has created. Now, as I say, I've put aside the question of whether we are genuinely meritocratic. Don't have to think we are. But even if we were, we would face the problem of designing our society in a way that more adequately took seriously the fact that everybody is entitled to a decent and dignified human life. And the fact that the system that has rewarded the meritocrats, a system, the global system that has produced huge amounts of wealth over the last few decades, has been constructed in such a way that so little of that wealth has been shared with those who have been losing out under it, is a reflection of, I think, a failure to see that that is the proper challenge. So Mark invited us to engage in diagnosis. This is my diagnosis of part of the problem. Like his diagnosis, it doesn't lead to a proposal for treatment, except to say that we should think about these things in a different way from the way we currently do. How we figure out how to get the correct picture out there, that's a genuine challenge. It's a challenge for intellectuals to think about how to do that. And I don't have any very easy answers to it, but I think that at least with this diagnosis, we can see that that is something that we have to persuade everybody of, and that that respectful engagement with one another that would be generated by that different picture might be the basis for bringing us closer together across the great divides that now separate us from one another. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Appiah. I would ask Professor Sheri Berman to step in. Please, Professor Berman. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Those are not easy sets of comments to follow. I will start by some responses that were that Mark's lecture prompted from me. So there's no doubt, as the topic of this conference reflects, that we are living in the West and in the United States in particular in more divided societies. And one reason, not the only reason for those divisions, has to do with the growing diversity of our societies. And by diversity, I don't just mean demographic. It's certainly true that in both the United States and Western Europe, we now have higher numbers of foreign-born citizens than we've had pretty much forever, but also because many groups whose voices had been politically repressed no longer are. So the mobilization of African Americans, of women, of sexual minorities, this has in essence increased the diversity of our societies by increasing the voices and the demands that are heard and pressed on our political systems. Now, I'm fairly confident that everyone in this Zoom room thinks that these trends towards growing diversity are positive, but it would be remiss of us, I think, not to recognize that growing diversity can, not must, but can create problems for democracy, or at least create challenges for democracy that we need to be forthright about. Mark's talk pointed out one way in which diversity can create challenges for democracy, and that is by creating problems with achieving the kind of social unity or fellow feeling that democracy requires to function well. Now, it took me about half a second to do a Google search and find tons of headlines in mostly left-wing publications proclaiming that there's no such thing as good patriotism, that calls for national solidarity were simply a way of sort of repressing minorities and trying to lengthen the domination of sort of existing minorities. But these are, I think, very counterproductive kinds of responses. It is indeed very hard to have a well-functioning democracy without some sense of social unity, the kind of fellow feeling and commitment that, again, Mark raised, echoing some of Tocqueville's original insights. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why these things are necessary for democracy. Again, to sort of use Mark's phrase, they kind of help to act as the sort of immune system for democracy. They help democratic societies overcome challenges. These are quotidian challenges like, why should I pay taxes to support a welfare state if I don't feel like I have a commitment to my fellow citizens? Or existential challenges like, why should I fight in a war for a country that I don't believe I have some commitment to? So if we don't have these kinds of things, it just becomes very difficult for democracy to function. These types of beliefs are indeed much easier to foster in homogenous societies, right? Again, to use some of the phrases that Mark used, I guess gathered from Tocqueville, it's much easier to have this sort of self-love mirror if the mirror that you look in reflects people who worship like you do, look like you do, yada, yada, yada. So that's one way I think we have to recognize, right, is that more diverse societies complicate the achievement of that social unity and fellow feeling that Mark discussed. My glance over the rest of the conference leads me to raise two other complications or challenges that I think diversity raises. One, I think, is going to be raised by my fellow panelists, just glancing briefly at some comments that he sent in advance, which is that when we have more diverse societies and people are very attached to their particular rather than national identities, we tend to have a politics that's much more characterized by morality, right? Where we have, a sort of sense of politics as kind of involving moral issues. And this makes the bargaining and the compromise that is necessary for democracy much more difficult. It's very hard to compromise and bargain over identity issues, over issues of morality, things that are seen in existential terms, right? Politics in those kinds of situations can very easily take on a kind of zero-sum quality, a sense that losing power is really not just, a sort of temporary setback, but an absolute threat to the ability to defend yourself and to defend your communities. You know, just to get to a very obvious comparison to the post-war decades, it's just much easier for democracy to function when political competition pivots around economic issues and class identities than when it pivots around moral issues and ethnic identities. I think we have to recognize that that is indeed a challenge. The third way, again, I'm guessing from the slides that were sent around by one of the panelists in the next panel by Darren Asamoglu, is that diversity can complicate democracy by interacting in some very problematic ways with certain economic trends, right? There's tons of evidence from economics, political science, and elsewhere that in tough economic times, like the ones we've experienced in the United States and the West over the past decades, that racial and ethnic divisions are easily triggered. They become politically salient in very problematic ways. It's very easy, obviously, in tough economic times to scapegoat the other, right? To blame the other for the problems that you and your communities are facing. It's very easy to create a sense of competition over public resources in a way that would not be the case in more prosperous times. It's very easy to create, the problems emerge, again, I think reflecting something that Marx says, in particular when ethnic cleavages and these economic divisions coincide, when they reinforce. So if you have certain ethnic groups that are predominantly on one side of the economic divide, let's say particularly poor or particularly rich, right? That was the case of Jews, for instance, in Europe, that this kind of situation, these kinds of reinforcing cleavages, economic and identity, make it much easier to create a sense of other, to deepen divisions. So I think that these are some real challenges, right? Real ways in which diversity can, again, not must, but can complicate the functioning of democracy. And I think that for those of us who value both diversity and democracy, we need to confront these challenges or these tensions head on. We can't avoid them. We can't just assume that they will simply disappear. For example, as some on the left kind of assume that, you know, once the United States became a majority minority country, that, you know, these problems would disappear because, you know, the reactionary folks who used to be in the majority would now be in the minority and we wouldn't have to worry about their concerns anymore, right? Sort of to paraphrase the great James Baldwin, you can't solve a problem before you confront it. So I hope that this conference is part of an attempt not just to kind of analyze these divisions, but to come to reasonable, if not conclusions, to generate perhaps reasonable discussions about how we can actually, again, confront these challenges rather than wish them away, right? So I'll end with Mark's rather pessimistic final comments, right? So he says, can we imagine a new basis for unity, a kind of post-modern patriotism? I regret to say I cannot. Well, I would say that if more conferences like this don't dedicate themselves to proving him wrong, to figuring out some way that we can overcome divisions while at the same time promoting and protecting the differences that make the United States in particular special and unique, that our societies will continue to fracture and our democracies will continue to decay. So on that cheery note, I will pass the baton.
Thank you very much, Professor Berman. I ask Professor Buruma to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to respond. I read Mark's piece with great interest. One thing that seemed to me to be missing from his analysis, very good analysis of Tocqueville, was the role that religion plays in democracy in America in particular. And Tocqueville took the view that for a democracy to work, a secular democracy that is based on individual enlightened interest, you need a moral basis that can sort of serve as a glue to keep the community, the democratic nation together. And so he took the role of Christianity, as I'm sure everybody knows, extremely seriously and thought it was a sine qua non of American-style democracy to work. He also thought that American Christianity, having liberated itself from the authority of the sort of official church, by which, as a good Frenchman, he of course meant largely the Vatican, that American Christianity had in some ways secularized, and he said American Christians are all Republicans, by which of course he did not mean Republicans with a capital R. He meant that they're all Democrats. Now, Thomas Jefferson was widely denounced in his time by some Christians, by Christian zealots, for insisting on the separation of church and state, without which, in his view, democracy couldn't work either. But even though he was denounced, I think this division held for a long time, and in some ways was even strengthened when zealous Christians made fools of themselves, as happened during the monkey trial about evolution that took place, I believe, in Tennessee. And after that, I think a lot of evangelical Christians withdrew from the political scene and didn't really re-emerge until not so very long ago. And I think if we look at the United States today, something very peculiar seems to have happened, because this is a country that was founded almost entirely by Protestants, with a constitution written almost entirely. I think there was one Catholic involved. And now we have a Supreme Court dominated by conservative Catholics. There's only one Protestant Chief Justice, and he was raised as a Catholic. We have, not for very long, I'm glad to say, but we have an Attorney General who is a right-wing Catholic. And so the right-wing Catholics, as opposed to the more liberal kind represented by the next president and the Speaker of the House, have also forged a peculiar alliance with the evangelicals. And what they have in common, apart from things like the right to life, but is a desire to break down the barriers that were set up so carefully by Jefferson and people and like-minded people. I think there is a real assault now on the barriers that keep church and state separate. And this, I think, is a real problem on the right in America. On the left, I think you can still see what a profoundly religious country America is, something that Tocqueville saw clearly, but I think it's still true, because I think on the left, what you see more and more is a kind of secular form of religious zeal, where strongly held ideological positions, ideological and moral positions, as is true of most religious dogma, on gender, on race, etc., have become so prominent in politics that people, just as happens when in periods of religious zealotry, people are judged and tested and rejected, if necessary, on the, hello? Did somebody speak up in protest? Okay, I'll continue. But people are judged on the purity of their belief in the prevailing ideology or dogma. And I agree entirely with Sheri Berman that this has led too often to a kind of zero-sum game, to political positions that can no longer be negotiated, where ideally in a democracy, people negotiate interests or stand for interests which can be rationally debated and lead to compromises. Once things are held sacred, and that can be true of people who think of themselves as secular, as well as people who think of themselves as religious. When things are held sacred, no compromise is really possible anymore. And I think this is one of the things that is tearing America apart at the moment. And that is why I don't think there will be any kind of possibility of a reconciliation and an atmosphere of rational debate and compromise until this culture war that is so destructive on both sides subsides. And I think there's perhaps one possible tiny little sliver of hope for a Biden administration, in that Biden is very well placed to concentrate on the economy more than on culture war. And when the economy becomes the center of political discourse, this brings me to my last point, which is really a response to Anthony Appiah's presentation, that really raises the question of the division of labor and how you do this, because it's all very well to say that everybody finds their own niche and everybody chooses to something that they're good at and should be appreciated for it and so on, but people still have to do the dirty work. And one way to do that is to base it on class and birth and or caste even. You're born to do certain jobs. They may be unpleasant jobs, but that's what you were born to do. Now, we all agree that that's not an ideal system. In America, in fact, America set up not to have a system like that, except in the case of slavery and many would argue the descendants of slaves. But the meritocratic idea, of course, was precisely established to replace the division of labor based on birth and class. And I can see the flaws of the meritocratic system. I'm not entirely sure how to replace it with something else that still makes sure that some people have to do the dirty work and other people enjoy the fruits of it, and which is not a very happy conclusion either, but I will conclude with that nonetheless.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Buruma. I think we can get another 5 or 10 minutes extra time for the questions. So I give up my question if there is anyone in the audience asking his own questions. Is anyone here asking a question?
There are some questions in the chat, which I'm happy to read aloud, or if you would like to do so, if you can see them.
Go ahead. Yes.
Okay. So this was, well, would any of the panelists care to make a short retort or reply? Is there anything, a 2-finger on anything? Yes, Mark, I'd like to give you the chance to take a couple of minutes, please.
Yeah, just very quickly. Those are all very helpful comments. Just very quickly on each of them. When it comes to respect, it's very interesting that to me that Anthony posed it as a philosophical mistake rather than a psychological challenge. And respect's an interesting thing. I mean, it's one of those things where buried in it might be an idea, but it only works if it's a feeling. It's not something that we calculate and reflect on and then bestow on somebody. It's something that in some way is spontaneous, given the way we're trained and so on. And so the psychological dimension of that, I think, makes it a much more difficult challenge even than the one that he suggested, because of this mistake, because of our confusion of what constitutes merit. On Sheri's point, I agree with her, but what occurs to me in listening to her is that I think that the more interesting divide is not between, let's say, a white population whose ancestors have been here a while and new groups who come in, or non-white groups. The really interesting divide that has developed is the attitudes toward non-whites. The attitudes felt and expressed by meritocrats as opposed to non-meritocratic whites. That is, the divide is not between whites and non-whites. It's within the white population in their attitudes towards non-whites. And that is something that's generating, I think, a lot of our misunderstanding, an inability to understand that someone else may have a different view on cultural diversity. So it's not the diversity itself, but the attitudes towards it. And as for Ian, I simply want to tell a little anecdote. because I think he's absolutely right. But the antidote has to do with our cluelessness about the religious, and not the challenge that religious Catholics and evangelicals might pose. One out of every 4 or 5, depending on how you count, American adults considers themselves an evangelical. By looking at Hollywood, television, and movies, you would never guess that. If all that was left of our civilization were cultural content that we produce right now, you would never guess what the country actually looks like. And here the cluelessness, and I think, the source of danger and problems is on our side, not theirs, because we simply are unable to imagine a kind of life that revolves around religious view, religious just practice and life. And it helps to explain why there's so much surprise about the results of the election, that certain minority groups were not, more overwhelmingly Democratic. But that's also because what may come first in a lot of people's lives is their religion. And if you're Hispanic and Catholic, abortion is a concern for you. If you go to a Black church, matters of homosexuality may be more prominent in your mind than in other contexts. So the anecdote very quickly is this. I once asked a group of students what % of Americans they thought were evangelical. And, they went from 5% to 90%, right? And then I asked them, what % of the population do you think is transgender? And they all said about 1–2%. And I said, well, these numbers probably underestimated, but when Pew last calculated, it was less than 0.5%. And then I asked, which group do you feel you've learned more about at Columbia? And they all laughed, because the answer was, of course, they'd learned more about the transgender than they had learned about American evangelicals. That's on our side. And that's something I think that has to change, that we need more empathy and just plain understanding of how this huge section of the American population lives and thinks.
I just want to call on Craig Calhoun, who had a 2-finger. Please, Craig.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Mark, for a great talk and great comments just now in response to Ian. I only wanted to add, the opinion poll category, do you think you are, or do you consider yourself an evangelical, is not the same as having your life revolve around religious commitments. That, notionally something like half of evangelicals don't go to church, are not engaged in a religious community. It's a ideological commitment, it's an identity claim. And so I think the division among evangelicals is significant. And you in your original remarks noted that it's in fact the meritocrats who are more likely to go to church often. So there's an issue there, just I wanted to note to be worked out.
Can I just say something about the, Ian's very good question about the dirty work. There are 2 things that I'd like to say about that. One is that one of the tasks of technology is to reduce the amount of dirty work, to make and a lot of dirty work has been displaced by. And the second thing is that dirty work is a cultural category, not a technological category. And whether work is thought of as dirty is something that can change over time, because it is a cultural category. And so it seems to me there are at least 2 things that are part of the project that I was suggesting. One is to minimize the amount of work that's in some sense dirty, but the other is to make sure that we don't treat as dirty work that is in fact making an enormous positive social contribution and should not be regarded in the way that talking about work as dirty work sometimes suggests. So I think to use the technical language of the here, I think we should try to reduce the number of shit jobs, and we should also reduce as much as we can the number of bullshit jobs.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm perfectly happy also to replace the word dirty with boring. A lot of boring work simply has to be done, and people don't necessarily get great satisfaction out of it. But to Mark's point, I totally agree that we should have empathy and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that whatever people are entirely entitled to place religion as the most important thing in their lives. But what I would argue is that in the political sphere, for us to have a political discourse, we should really leave that kind of thing. That kind of thing should be kept private. And as soon as religious values become part of the public political discourse, then you get into a realm of where it becomes very difficult to come to any kind of compromises or debate, because these are not debatable issues. And it seems to me that you have to try and concentrate political argument on really on interests, where things and interests which can be reasonably debated, where compromises are possible. As soon as something is sacred, you cannot compromise on the sacred. And so I think we can understand people who think that the right to life or their religious values are the most important things in their lives, and more. Oops, I'm so sorry. But I think they should be kept out of our political life.
No, but Ian, I actually don't think you believe that, because to begin with, so many of our basic political values have been built upon particularly biblical foundations. Beliefs in human equality are, derive, at least as we stated them, from this Protestant tradition that Tocqueville talks about at the very beginning of the book. So it's not as if there's a set of religious views and then non-religious views. It's that your picture, let's say, of the connection between God, man, and the world will give you a certain understanding of what's healthy for people, what's not healthy for people, what human dignity and might be, what the source of authority is, and so on. And so it's one thing to let people's views, however, on whatever basis they derive them, simply have standing, but no higher standing than anyone else in public discussion. And those who want to reshape the political order based on their religious views. And that's impermissible. But the first is, it has to be permissible, because your faith will shape, all of your values if you take it seriously.
Just to thank everybody for this great discussion, and I wish everybody a very pleasant follow of this discussion with the reset. Thank you very much.